educated. She was largely educated by reading her father's library, and she often mentions books in her letters. Hang on, I just have to do something here. Something has popped up that I need to get rid of. No, I think I'll just carry on regardless. Okay, so it's inevitable that reading turns up in Jane's own novels. But does she use reading as an indicator of character, good or bad? Well, you bet she does. An awful lot of reading goes on in Jane Austen's novels. It's a reflection of the leisured landed classes who populate the novels and who had all those long hours to fill. It's interesting to work out who the readers are and whether Jane Austen expects us to believe it's a good or a bad trait in that particular character. We might expect her to universally approve of reading as a good thing, but as we will see, this was not always the case. In the next 45 minutes or so, in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about who reads, who doesn't read, what they're reading, how they read, and finally, who's got a library. So first of all, who are the readers? Catherine Morland is one of the people who springs to mind as a reader within the pages of Jane Austen. Her mania for Gothic romances drives the plot of Northanger Abbey and leads her into error. Firstly, we experience with her the first night terrors during that thunderstorm at Northanger Abbey, encouraged, it has to be said, by the mischievous Henry Tilney on the journey there. But later, more seriously, she starts to surmise that something terrible has happened to the late Mrs. Tilney. But are we meant to be as disapproving of these trashy novels as a casual reading might lead us to believe? Firstly, there's the famous defence of the novel in chapter 5 of Northanger Abbey. Although our productions have afforded more extensive and unaffected pleasure than those of any other literary corporation in the world, no species of composition has been so much decried. Secondly, Jane Austen herself liked a trashy novel. Here she is in a letter in 1813. I am looking over Self-Control again, and my opinion is confirmed of its being an excellently meant, elegantly written work, without anything of nature or probability in it. I do not know whether Laura's passage down the American River is not the most natural, possible, everyday thing she ever does. Self-Control by Mary Brunton was a wildly successful novel of 1811, in which the heroine undergoes all sorts of improbable adventures, such as being kidnapped and taken to America, and then faking her own death by tying herself to a canoe and going down rapids. Note that word Jane Austen uses. Again, she's read this more than once, so it appears she enjoyed entertaining Tosh as much as the rest of us. Back to Catherine. Catherine doesn't just read Gothic romances. We're told that as a child, she liked stories, as long as not too much reflection was required. And as she moved into her teens, she has learned quotations from Pope and Shakespeare, and they'll both turn up again, and she reads sonnets. So Catherine is a reader, and if one particular genre has led her into error, by the end of Northanger Abbey, she's acknowledged this. I like to think she'll continue to enjoy her trashy romances, but she sees them for what they are and is no longer at risk of confusing them with real life. Another character led into trouble by reading is Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility. We already know she's fond of books and reading when she has her fateful meeting with Willoughby. After he's rescued her, he calls the next day, and as Eleanor puts it, in one morning, Marianne has ascertained Mr. Willoughby's opinion on almost every matter of importance. After music and dancing, they get on to books. She proceeded to question him on the subject of books. Her favourite authors were brought forward and dwelt upon with so rapturous a delight that any young man of 25 must have been insensible indeed not to become an immediate convert to the excellence of such works, however disregarded before. Their taste was strikingly alike, The same books, the same passages were idolised by each, or if any difference appeared, any objection arose, it lasted no longer than till the force of her arguments and the brightness of her eyes could be displayed. Does anybody else think Willoughby might be a wee bit of a yes man here? They discuss Cooper, Scott, and Pope. Cooper was a precursor to the great age of romantic poetry, known to be admired by Jane Austen. Scott is now mainly remembered for his novels, but was initially known for epic poetry, romantic poetry. His epic poem Marmion is also mentioned by Anne Elliot. And here's what Eleanor says to Marianne afterwards. You know what he thinks of Cooper and Scott. You're certain of his estimating their beauties as he ought, and you've received every assurance of his admiring Pope no more than is proper. Poor Alexander Pope was somewhat out of favour around the time Sense and Sensibility was published. Much of his work was satirical in nature, and at the time he had been superseded by the Romantic poets. As Marianne remains laid up with her injured ankle, Willoughby visits daily, and reading together is a favourite activity, accelerating their closeness. Reading love poetry with Willoughby clouds Marianne's judgment, just as Catherine's Gothic novels do in Northanger Abbey. And then, of course, Willoughby's off. So what does Marianne do? She wallows. In books, as well as in music, she courted the misery which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had been used to read together. Towards the end of the book, and this is my statutory slide featuring the lovely Alan Rickman, towards the end of the book, when Marianne is convalescing from her illness, reading also forms part of her recovery. She resolves to read for 6 hours a day, and I'm not sure how many of us have managed that, even during lockdown. And the reading proposed seems to have a different tenor. Her own books she dismisses as too well known and only suitable for amusement, but she plans to borrow books from her neighbours at Barton Park and also from Colonel Brandon. Marianne's journey tames her irrepressible, impulsive nature, and it seems her reading habits may have changed also. An altogether more sensible reader is Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, and I'll let you enjoy this cartoon for a minute. When I found it, I had to email the artist and say, please, 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 can I use it? Fanny's cousin Edmund discovers early on that she has a fondness for reading and encourages and directs her taste. As she gets older, she's purchased her own books from the first hour of her commanding a shilling. And by the time she's established in the former schoolroom, she has quite a collection. It's notable that the schoolroom in Mansfield only becomes a place of thinking and learning once the Bertram sisters have vacated it. Fanny clearly enjoys a good weighty read. At one point, Edmund, who has interrupted her reading to consult her about his acting in the play and also to go on about how wonderful Mary Crawford is, apologises for the interruption with, "You in the meantime will be taking a trip to China, I suppose. How does Lord Macartney go on?" Lord Macartney was an ambassador to China, and an account of his time there was published in 1807. I can imagine it might contain some heavy-duty, dry subject matter and be quite hard going. Give me Catherine Morland's novels any day. Fanny is a quick learner, for all that her cousins have dismissed her childhood efforts. She reads the play Lover's Vows, and although shocked, she quickly has sufficient familiarity with it to be able to help several cast members with their lines. And when she's in danger of having to play the cottager's wife, Maria states that Fanny already knows every word of the part, having spotted her correcting Mrs. Grant at a previous rehearsal. The ability to memorise passages quickly is not given to everyone, and particularly not to poor dim Mr. Rushworth. Once banished to Portsmouth, Fanny makes the best of it by joining a circulating library and reading with Susan. So just as Edmund shaped Fanny's early reading, she's now doing the same for Susan. The two sisters hide upstairs with their books from the chaos of the household. Reading is Fanny's lifelong solace, and you just know that the parsonages at Thornton Lacey and Mansfield will be places of learning and study. If you're like me, you'll have assumed Elizabeth Bennet is a reader, but when you look closely, actually, she's not really. She gives an accurate appraisal of herself during her stay at Netherfield. Pardon me. After Caroline Bingley has accused her of being a great reader and having no pleasure in anything else, she says, "I deserve neither such praise nor such censure. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." And although she goes and picks up a book, the others present are chatting, and within a very few moments, Elizabeth was so much caught with what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table. She's much more interested in the chat that's going on in the room, and we don't ever see Elizabeth reading a book again in the whole novel. There are, of course, a couple of devoted readers in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Bennet and Mary, neither of whom are an advert for the pastime. Trapped in an unhappy marriage, books are one of Mr. Bennet's principal enjoyments, and with a book he's said to be regardless of time. But Mr. Bennet does not read in the family circle as Elizabeth was doing at Netherfield. He retreats alone to his library, which is the Jane Austen equivalent of hiding in the garden shed. His annoyance when others come into the sanctum is clear, perhaps understandable when the invader is Mr. Collins, but he also chases his wife and favourite daughter out during a family crisis, that of Lizzie's refusal of Mr. Collins. "I shall be glad to have the library to myself as soon as may be." Mr. Bennet has abdicated most of his paternal responsibilities, and shutting himself away in the library is emblematic of that. I feel a bit sorry for Mary Bennet. She's a figure of fun, but what's she doing to deserve it? She's trying to improve herself by study, and yet is subjected to ridicule by her father, her younger sisters, and even her creator, Jane Austen, because of it. Perhaps it's because she's a bit of a plodder, but it's not given to all to be as witty and sparkling as Elizabeth or as beautiful as Jane. Fanny Price is keen on reading for self-improvement and also a bit dull, but she's treated far more kindly by her author than poor Mary. Still, towards the end of the book, things are looking up. Jane is engaged to Bingley and Mary is petitioning for use of the library at Netherfield. So that's a quick run through some of the readers, but who doesn't read? There are only two characters in all of Jane Austen whom we are specifically told do not read, and they're both in Persuasion. Charles Musgrove has trifled away his time without benefit from books, and Captain Harville was no reader. Interestingly, these are both characters of whom Jane Austen generally wants us to think, well, they're good guys. There are, of course, a whole lot more characters whom we may surmise don't read. The younger Bennet sisters, the Musgrove girls, the Steele sisters. None of the silly young women is ever spotted reading. But there are some who should know better, for their education has not been lacking. Our first offender is Emma, that wonderful maker of reading lists. Lovely gullible Mrs. Weston tells Mr. Knightley she thinks Harriet and Emma will read together, despite having failed to make much headway with Emma's reading herself. And events prove the sceptical Mr. Knightley correct. Her views of improving her little friend's mind by a great deal of useful reading and conversation had never yet led to more than a few first chapters and the intention of going on tomorrow. It was much easier to chat than to study. Emma declares she will read more to occupy her time when she grows old. Emma is not my favourite heroine anyway, and I'm going to give her another black mark because she considers old that is when she's 40 or 50. Caroline Bingley pretends to be a great reader. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. Since Jane Austen has already told us that Darcy has an excellent library, I think we know what she's getting at here. Caroline is showing off to Darcy, who's also reading. She's picked up the second volume of the book Darcy is engaged with and is trying to catch his attention. Unless she happens to have previously read volume 1, which I think we can agree is unlikely, she's just making herself look ridiculous. I'm sure you can tell me about other favourite readers or non-readers at the end, but we're now going to move on to what are they reading? Pardon me. Firstly, they read books. Books are widely read in the novels. We're used to inexpensive, easily affordable books, but this was not always the case. They were an expensive luxury item during Jane Austen's time. A few years ago, a bookseller's bill for Sense and Sensibility was found in the Prince Regent's papers in the Royal Archive. He had paid 15 shillings for all 3 volumes of Sense and Sensibility in 1811. I don't know if you can make it out in the middle of that form where it says books underlined. The next line below that says October the 28th, Sense and Sensibility, 3 volumes, something I can't read, and then 15 shillings. Interestingly, this bill is dated 2 days before the first public advertisement of Sense and Sensibility. It has been suggested that his regular bookseller, Beckett and Porter of Pall Mall, knew their client's taste and had recommended it. And they must have been pretty sharp, because remember, this is an unpublished author. This is her first novel. And we know that the Prince Regent did enjoy Jane Austen's books to the extent that the poor soul ended up having to dedicate Emma to him somewhat against her judgment. Anyway, he paid 15 shillings for these books. Conversion of monetary value is always difficult, but it's been estimated that 15 shillings in 1811 is roughly equivalent to £75 today. So much as we treasure our Jane Austen editions, I don't think many of us would stump up that kind of money for an unknown novelist now. Nor were books supplied complete, as we would expect them to be now. They would be unbound or in boards, i.e. with a plain card cover. And the purchaser would pay extra to have them bound to their requirements, usually in leather. For an aristocratic family, they might have a specific colour that they wanted, or the coat of arms included on the binding. A Miss Jane Austen of Steventon was a pre-publication subscriber to Fanny Burney's novel Camilla, paying 1 guinea for the privilege. This was a sort of crowdfunding of its day and was actually quite a good way for an author to get the money in first. Camilla had over 1,000 subscribers paying a guinea each, so Fanny Burney did pretty well from that. Anyway, a guinea for Jane Austen, who was at that time 21, was quite a significant sum, although it's traditionally believed her father treated her to the subscription. And that would indicate that Jane Austen was seriously devoted to Fanny Burney. Which one of us would not stump up in support of a new novel by Jane Austen before its publication? In Northanger Abbey, Catherine tells Isabella that books do not often fall her family's way. Her mother's read Sir Charles Grandison several times because that's all they've got. You can imagine they would not be very affordable on the income of a country parson with a large family to support. However, another country parson with a large family, the Reverend George Austen, had 500 books, which is remarkable. No wonder he had to take in students to supplement his income, and I do wonder what Mrs. Austen might have thought of all these books. Novels were slightly disapproved of, as we've already heard about in Northanger Abbey. In Pride and Prejudice, when Mr. Collins is invited to read to the ladies on his visit to Longbourn, he refuses the first choice as he never reads novels. And worse, it comes from the circulating library. He settles for Fordyce's Sermons, full title, Fordyce's Sermons for Young Women. Books of morality and conduct, especially for girls, were popular at the time. Mrs. Morland threatens Catherine with an improving essay when she's moping about at home towards the end of Northanger Abbey. Non-fiction books were also read. Eleanor Tilney is particularly fond of history, which surprises Catherine. And Fanny, as mentioned, is reading about Lord Macartney's exploits in China. In 1813, Jane Austen writes to Cassandra that she has been reading, and I'll pick up my paper to make sure I get this right, an essay on the military police and institutions of the British Empire by Captain Passley, which, despite being reluctant at first, she's finding delightfully written and highly entertaining. And I don't know about you, but I think I'll take her word for it on that. Poetry is another thing that is read. A number of characters read and can recite poetry. It was, as Anne Elliot discusses with Captain Benwick, a rich age for poetry. Now, this might be my deliberate mistake in this talk. I'm not familiar enough with this version of Persuasion to know that whether that's Sally Hawkins as Anne Elliot, is she speaking to Captain Benwick or Captain Harville? And I'm hoping somebody will tell me at the end whether I've got it horribly wrong. Anyway, she's speaking to somebody about poetry, I'm going to say that. So the two of them share a taste for poetry and they enjoy discussing it, although Anne thinks that Captain Benwick is a little too immersed in it and recommends more prose. It doesn't work, but it's all for the best because he and Louisa subsequently fall in love over poetry. Marianne and Willoughby read poetry together. Enough said. Since we're the Scottish branch, I can't let Jane Austen's passage on Robert Burns go unmentioned. It's in Sanditon, and Sir Edward Denham, an upper-class twit, is trying to impress Charlotte, the heroine, with his knowledge of poetry. I should warn you, in a novel filled with illnesses, imagined or otherwise, Sir Edward's affliction is verbal diarrhea, and I've edited this excerpt. It's actually about 3 times as long. But while we're on the subject of poetry, what think you, Miss Heywood, of Burns' lines to his Mary? Oh, there is pathos to madden one. If ever there was a man who felt, it was Burns. Burns is always on fire. His soul was the altar in which lovely women sat enshrined. His spirit truly breathed the immortal incense which is her due. I say it goes on for a bit longer. I have read several of Burns' poems with great delight, said Charlotte as soon as she had time to speak. But I am not poetic enough to separate a man's poetry entirely from his character. And poor Burns' known irregularities greatly interrupt my enjoyment of his lines. I have difficulty in depending on the truth of his feelings as a lover. I have not faith in the sincerity of the affections of a man of his descriptions. He felt and he wrote and he forgot. Well now, isn't that interesting? We think this business about separating the art from the personality of the artist is a very modern woke concern. You know, is it okay to like the music of Michael Jackson or Wagner? And somebody was having a go at Enid Blyton again this week, apparently. But there's Jane Austen dealing with it 200 years ago, so nothing is new. Moving on to plays, and I'll have another swig of gin and tonic, you know. Plays do seem to be read for pleasure more than we do now. Perhaps too many of us have bad memories of being dragged through Shakespeare in class at school. Willoughby was reading Hamlet aloud to the Dashwood ladies, and Fanny reads Henry VIII to Lady Bertram. And then, of course, there's the play at Mansfield Park. Several plays are in contention for selection, and including some by Shakespeare. And there's mention of many volumes of plays lying on a table. And once Lover's Vows has been decided upon, there seem to be numerous copies. Sometimes things about Jane Austen's books bother me. Where did all these plays come from? Were they already in the house? Could they be ordered up in the space or two? This is where we're going to miss Deirdre Le Fay. She would have known the answer to this question. However, wherever all these plays came from, they don't last long. On Sir Thomas's return, he burns every unbound copy of Lover's Vows in the house. Some characters read what we might loosely call specialist publications. Not that sort, although I think there were plenty of them around at the time. They don't turn up in Jane Austen. Robert Martin, the farmer, reads the agricultural reports. But Jane Austen lets us know he's more cultured than Emma gives him credit for by telling us he also reads books to himself, and as reported by Harriet, that makes him downright intellectual. There are books lying about at Abbey Mill Farm, and he's also read some novels. So there's Jane Austen using books to show us that Emma's view of this character is incorrect. He's a little more educated and knowledgeable than she's going to give him credit for. Sir Walter Elliot reads nothing but the Baronetage, mainly his own entry, and Anne Elliot reads Navy lists to follow Captain Wentworth's progress from afar. There were a number of Navy lists which Anne might have been consulting, but the most popular time was Steele's original and correct list of the Royal Navy. Now, I don't know about you, but I was thinking of some big encyclopedic type of volume, but in fact, Steele's Navy List is a smallish pamphlet produced and updated monthly. There's a very interesting article by Hazel Jones of the Southwest branch. I know some of the Southwest branch are here. I'm not sure if Hazel actually is. In Jasna's Persuasions Online, winter 2018, all about Navy lists and about where and how Anne would be getting her information if you want to find out more about this. Once the Musgrove girls have met Captain Wentworth, they persuade their father to get Uppercross's first Navy list. Another reader of the Navy list is that invalided Lieutenant of the Marines, Mr. Price. So it's clearly the Bible for anyone with a connection to or interest in the Navy. They also read newspapers. There are a surprising number of newspapers around in rural Georgian England. They're mentioned several times and often allow a character to be rude, to the extent that I think Jane Austen knew a rude newspaper reader. In Sense and Sensibility, the marvellously rude Mr. Palmer, having been brought to meet the Dashwoods for the first time, slightly bowed to the ladies without speaking a word, and after briefly surveying them and their apartments, took a newspaper up from the table and continued to read it as long as he stayed. The talk in the room turns to Charlotte Palmer's pregnancy, which is too much for the ultra-refined Lady Middleton. Lady Middleton could no longer endure such a conversation and therefore exerted herself to ask Mr. Palmer if there was any news in the paper. No, none at all, he replied, and read on. I love Mr. Palmer. He's one of those fabulous minor characters who populate Jane Austen's novels and give them their depth and richness. In Mansfield Park, when Fanny arrives in Portsmouth, on her first evening there, everyone else has gone about their business elsewhere in the house, leaving her alone for the first time with her father, whom she's not seen for many years. He takes out his newspaper and reads it, ignoring his long absent daughter while hogging the only candle in the room. In Persuasion, in the scene where Captain Wentworth rescues Anne from her annoying nephew, Charles Hayter arrives at Uppercross Cottage to find Captain Wentworth, whom he perceives as a rival for Henrietta's affections, is already there. Captain Wentworth came from his window, apparently not ill-disposed for conversation, but Charles Hayter soon put an end to his attempts by seating himself near the table and taking up the newspaper. How rude. There was a proliferation of newspapers in this period. In 1816, there were 31 national newspapers in England, 14 in London alone. There would also be regional newspapers published in places like Bath, such as the one where Sir Walter Elliot reads of the arrival of his grand cousin, the Dowager Viscountess Dalrymple. A gentleman could subscribe and have a London newspaper sent by mail to his country residence. They are mentioned at Hartfield, Kellynch, Uppercross and Barton Park. It would generally arrive the next day, although any foreign news reports would have taken several weeks to reach the publisher. So people would expect their news to be a bit out of date by the time the newspaper arrived, not like today where we have our 24-hour instant rolling news channels. Newspapers were heavily taxed and therefore relatively expensive, so they were often passed around, and we see this in the novels. Sir John Middleton sends his to the Dashwood ladies every day, and Mr. Price borrows his neighbour's newspaper, where of course he reads the report of the matrimonial fracas in the family of Mr. R of Wimpole Street, announcing the scandal of Maria and Henry Crawford. Such gossip was a regular feature of many publications, and the use of initials only, as seen in Mr. Price's newspaper, was common in an attempt to protect the publisher from lawsuits. And of course, we've recently had the Regency scandal sheet of Lady Whistledown in Bridgerton. I'm sure there's a whole talk to be had just on the letters in Jane Austen's fiction. There's an awful lot of them. It's believed that Jane Austen wrote 4 epistolary novels, i.e. purely composed of letters. Lady Susan and Love and Friendship remain as such, as well as a number of other shorter pieces of the juvenilia. But Eleanor and Marianne and First Impressions were reworked into Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, respectively, so she clearly felt the form wasn't working in those cases. However, lots of letters remain in those two novels. There are 40 of them in Pride and Prejudice alone. For an author, it's a wonderful way of cramming a lot of exposition into a compact form. For instance, in Darcy's long letter to Elizabeth after the first proposal. You'll have noticed this sort of thing can cause problems for the writers of TV and film adaptations, and it's always interesting to keep an eye out for how it's dealt with. Letters were often kept and reread. Elizabeth does it in Pride and Prejudice, as you see here in the image on the left. Mrs. Musgrove does it in Persuasion, but the mistress of this habit on the right is Miss Bates in Emma. Her letters give her so much pleasure and must be shared with all the neighbours. Perhaps this reflects how lonely and isolated she is. Any news from outside her own narrow existence is manna from heaven. However, not all the neighbours are so pleased to hear about them. One is sick of the very name of Jane Fairfax. Every letter from her is read 40 times over. Her compliments to all friends go round and round again. And if she does but send her aunt the pattern of a stomacher or knit a pair of garters for her grandmother, one hears of nothing else for a month. No prizes for guessing who the speaker here is. However, it's not just Miss Bates whose letters are public property. In Hartfield, the most claustrophobic of Austen's settings, everybody knows everybody else's business, and letters do seem to be a matter of public record, such as the letter from Frank Churchill to his new stepmother on his father's remarriage. For a few days, every morning visit in Highbury included some mention of the handsome letter Mrs. Weston had received. I suppose you've heard of the handsome letter Mr. Frank Churchill has written to Mrs. Weston. I understand it was a very handsome letter indeed. Mr. Woodhouse told me of it. Mr. Woodhouse saw the letter and says he never saw such a handsome letter in his life. Okay, I think we've got it. It was a handsome letter. Letters are often passed around and read by multiple people, sometimes intended by the writer, sometimes not. Harriet shows Emma Mr. Martin's letter of proposal, which I'm sure he didn't intend. Mrs. Weston shows Emma Frank Churchill's letter explaining himself, which he absolutely did intend, and she in turn shows it to Mr. Knightley. There's even a character in Jane Austen who gives his name to a particular type of letter, a Collins. I hope most of this audience will be familiar with the term, but for those who are not, it's a letter of thanks sent after a stay, particularly if a degree of over-egging might be called for. Disappointingly, although a couple of Mr. Collins' wonderful letters are reproduced in full, the actual Collins is not. This is all that the text says. The promised letter of thanks from Mr. Collins arrived on Tuesday, addressed to their father and written with all the solemnity of gratitude which a 12-month's abode in the family might have prompted. So we're deprived of the joy of the actual text of the original Collins, but Jane Austen has given us enough information to enjoy it without having it spelled out. In several novels, we modern day readers are introduced to a lost art, that of being able to read aloud to other adults entertainingly. We tend to lose that now once the children have grown up a bit. But it was a common practice in Jane Austen's time. In the absence of the telly, you were expected to be able to entertain your companions in the evenings, and reading aloud would be considered, with playing music or singing, as a social skill. In Sense and Sensibility, poor Edward Ferrars doesn't meet Marianne's exacting standards. But when it turns out Willoughby reads with all the sense and spirit which Edward had unfortunately wanted, well, that's Marianne's fate sealed. We later learn he'd been reading Hamlet to them before he left. You can just imagine Willoughby declaiming all those wonderful soliloquies to his rapt audience. In the play, the cruelty of Hamlet makes his love Ophelia ill, and she subsequently dies, so perhaps Marianne should have been paying more attention. Another reader aloud with limited success is Mr. Collins. He only manages to plod through 3 pages of Fordyce's sermons before Lydia interrupts him with some Meryton gossip. The farmer, Mr. Martin, although thought by Emma to be illiterate, entertains the ladies of his household and the visiting Harriet Smith by reading aloud from elegant extracts, which was a sort of Reader's Digest of the day. Mr. Elton reads aloud to entertain the ladies while Emma is painting Harriet. In these examples, it tends to be the ladies who are read to and the gentlemen who do the reading. While Mr. Darcy's list of required accomplishments for a lady include extensive reading, reading aloud is not on the list, so perhaps it was not expected of a lady, but it's clearly admired in a gentleman. The only female character who reads aloud in the novels is Fanny in Mansfield Park, who's reading Shakespeare aloud to Lady Bertram with just the two of them present. One can't quite imagine Fanny being quite as dynamic a performer as Willoughby, for instance, but her audience is less critical, and I can't imagine Lady Bertram wanting too much excitement. Being Fanny, she stops when she hears others arriving. Of course, that big show-off, Henry Crawford, cannot resist picking up the book and continuing. Fanny has already refused his proposal, and he's trying his best to get in her good books. She applies herself furiously to her sewing, but she could not abstract her mind 5 minutes. She was forced to listen. His reading was capital, and her pleasure in good reading extreme. To good reading, however, she had been long used. Her uncle read well, her cousins all, Edmund very well. But in Mr. Crawford's reading, there was a variety of excellence beyond what she had ever met with. Reading aloud was something Jane Austen herself experienced. Here she is in a letter to Cassandra in June 1808. Ought I to be very much pleased with Marmion? As yet I am not. James reads it aloud in the evening. Her brother James wrote plodding, ponderous poetry, so we might imagine his reading style would be closer to Edward Ferrars than Henry Crawford. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Marmion, Walter Scott's epic poem based around the Battle of Flodden Field. Perhaps some of you might have studied it at school. I had a look at it for the purposes of this talk, and oh dear, it does go on and on and on. I think I agree with Jane Austen about it. However, she did later crib a couple of lines. Her famous quote, "I do not write for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves," is a paraphrase of lines from Marmion, so she knew her poetry. And then there's the event we'd all love to have gate crashed. Miss Benn, the neighbour in Chawton, gets to hear Pride and Prejudice read by its author. Miss Benn dined with us on the very day of the book's coming, and in the evening we set fairly at it and read half the first volume to her, prefacing that having intelligence from Henry that such a work would soon appear, we had desired him to send it whenever it came out, and I believe it passed with her unsuspected. She was amused, poor soul, that she could not help, you know, with two such people to lead the way, but she really does seem to admire Elizabeth. So Jane Austen tells Miss Benn a deliberate little fib to explain why she had the book so quickly and to conceal her identity as its author. Oh, but lucky Miss Benn. Finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about who's got a library. Most large houses of the time would have a private library. There's one at Netherfield. When Elizabeth is choosing a book from the table in the drawing room, the one she sets aside after a few minutes, Bingley offered to fetch others from his library for her. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I have ever looked into. Bingley, bless him, is not a reader. However, we're immediately invited to compare and contrast with Darcy's library at Pemberley. Miss Bingley says, "What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You're always buying books." "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these." He can be a bit of a stuffed shirt sometimes, Darcy, can't he? Bless him. Anyway, so care of the library here is being used as an immediate contrast between Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley comes from trade and he's new money, so his father left a rather paltry selection of books. which we may suspect Mr. Bingley will not be adding to, whereas Mr. Darcy, from a long-established landowning family, has an impressive library and is developing it. We've already learned that books were expensive, so a fine and expanding library was a signifier of wealth. Mr. Bennet has his library for hiding in, as already alluded to. Mr. Collins has a rather lowlier bookroom at Hunsford Parsonage. There's a library at Northanger Abbey, which we're told is very grand. Well, it would be, wouldn't it, of course. And in Sense and Sensibility, Sir John has one at Barton Park, which Marianne intends to use. And the Palmers have one at Cleveland, which she does use. Marianne is said to have the knack of finding the library in any house. More interesting is who doesn't have a library, or it's never mentioned. Mansfield Park, one of the grandest houses in Jane Austen, has no mention of a library, despite one of her most assiduous readers living there. You would think Fanny would have sought it out, but we only hear about the books Fanny has collected herself. Sir Thomas has a bookcase in his room, we know, because it gets moved for the theatricals, but that's all we hear about. Perhaps this absence is emblematic of the intellectual poverty in that great house. What would we find in these private libraries? Fortunately, we have virtual access to one such library, and one that was extremely familiar to Jane Austen, that of her brother Edward at Godmersham Park. The Reading with Austen project has used an 1818 catalogue, i.e. round about Jane Austen's time, to recreate the library as it then was. And on the interactive website, you can visit the shelves and see the titles therein. The history of the collection may be the model for the Pemberley Library. It was built up over many years, with each generation adding to it. Some of the books were purchased by Edward during his grand tour. We know that Jane Austen enjoyed using it, as she mentions it several times in her letters. During a visit in 1813, she wrote to Cassandra that "we live in the library, except at meals, and have a fire every evening." On other occasions, she rejoiced in being "alone in the library, mistress of all I survey, with 5 tables, 28 chairs, and 2 fires, all to myself. What luxury!" The Godmersham Library contained works of English, French, ancient Greek, and Roman literature. You'll be glad to hear that on the south wall, centre section, there's a complete set of Jane Austen first editions. There are a surprising number of books in foreign languages. The non-fiction collection includes biographies, histories, geography, theological and travel writings. And a bit like now, in the absence of travel, reading about travel was the next best thing. Now, if I was very clever, I would be able to give you a live demonstration of this, but I'm not going to. But if you go on the website, that's the front page. So you click on Explore the Library, and then you can select what you want to look at. So at the moment, we're looking at the south wall, and there's the left, centre, and right shelves. And if you mouse your arrow over the spine of a book, a little window will pop up telling you what that book is. So we're looking at a journey from London to Genoa through England, Portugal, Spain, etc., written by Giuseppe Marco Antonio Baretti, published in 1770. And if you actually click on that window, it expands and gives you more information about it. Parts of the collection have been sold off at various times, but around 500 books still belong to the Knight family and are at Chawton House. This website is a fascinating resource, and if you want to lose an afternoon, it's well worth a browse among the virtual shelves to see what you can find. At that time, there were also public libraries, and we in the Scottish branch had an excellent talk from Sharon a couple of years ago about these. In the novels, there are libraries mentioned in Meryton, Brighton, Portsmouth and Lyme. There's also one in Sanditon. However, much of the activity in these libraries seems to be decidedly non-literary. Lydia reports that Colonel Foster and Captain Carter are often seen in Clark's library in Meryton. We may surmise the younger Bennet sisters might also spend some time there, but not necessarily to borrow the latest volumes. When Lydia visits Brighton, her letters home detail her activities. Well, some of her activities, as we later discover, but she talks about going to the library. They were just returned from the library, where such and such officers had attended them, and where she'd seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild. No mention of books there. Charlotte visits the library in Sanditon on her first day, but she's more tempted by the pretty trinkets sold there than the books. The honourable exception is the circulating library in Portsmouth, patronised by Fanny Price, who actually borrows books. It was a cheap way to access books. An example of a tariff from 1804 was 1 guinea per year, all the way down to £0.50 for a month. So shorter stays such as that of Fanny in Portsmouth could be accommodated relatively inexpensively. Perhaps this is an appropriate time to leave Jane Austen's reading characters with Fanny in a library. We've seen how Jane Austen weaves reading throughout her novels and how she uses the activity to tell us something about the characters, what they read, their attitude to the pastime, and how it can affect their actions. We've seen some differences between reading habits then and now, and thought about what possession of a private library might indicate. We all enjoy reading, we wouldn't be here otherwise, and it's wonderful to think that all these years later, there's something we share with Jane Austen and her characters. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing now.